Hello, everyone. I still see people joining, so I'll give everybody a few minutes. Sometimes the system just takes a few seconds to allow people to join. Nice to see everyone, all the names joining the webinar. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's nice to see several people in attendance. Before we get started, I wanted to give you some general housekeeping about how this webinar works. We'll be posting the link to the closed caption. So you can either watch the captionings through Zoom, or you can click on the separate link and pull up the captions in a separate window. It's up to you, whatever method you prefer to use. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our interpreters here, and I always forget to do so. So thank you so much for your work to our interpreters. And so I'll forget to say that later, so I wanted to put that in now. Secondly, for communication purposes, we can utilize chat. If you have any problems with the webinar, or you simply want to make a comment, share your opinion or your thought during the webinar, you can utilize the chat feature. For our question and answer period, please hold your questions till the end of the presentation. Later, you will have the opportunity to ask questions, and you can use the Q&A feature. We have a couple options there. You can either post the question in the chat and let us know that you would like to come on screen and ask the question yourself. And if you do so, we will promote you to panelist so you can turn on your camera and either speak or sign your question. If you'd rather type your question and have one of us read it, please let us know that you'd prefer to do it that way. And I will try my best to read your question in ASL. All right, so I've covered the chat feature, the Q&A, and the captioning, and welcomed everyone. So I'd like to now welcome one of our Penn students, Christina Kim, and turn it over to Christina for a formal introduction of our presenter today. Thank you, Christina. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ph.D. in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lecture hosted by Gallaudet University. This lecture series aims to honor world-renowned scientists in the field of psychology, education, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience. These different fields and all the interdisciplinary fields in between contribute to the new and growing field of educational neuroscience. They increase our understanding of the human mind and of the neural mechanisms of learning. This year's Distinguished Lecture Series theme is diversity, equity, and inclusivity. I am very honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer today, Dr. Anna Abraham. Dr. Abraham is an E. Paul Torrance Professor for Creativity and Gifted Education, the University of Georgia's Department of Educational Psychology. She works as the director of the Torrance Center for Creativity and Talent Development. Her educational and professional training in psychology is in psychology and neuroscience, but experience working in multiple universities and specialties worldwide, such as Germany, Kuwait, the UK, and the United States. has helped develop her interdisciplinary work. Dr. Abram researches creativity and other parts of human imagination through neurophysiological and physiological perspectives, brain structures, function, cognition, perception, action, motivation, and emotion. Focus topics include reality versus fantasy, mental state reasoning, future thinking and retrospection, social and self-referential cognition, and more. Dr. Abram's many publications and contributions to the study of creativity impact broad, including new methods, theories, experimental developments. She also wrote The Neuroscience of Creativity, co-authored the Cambridge Handbook of the Imagination, and is the co-founder and editor of the Cambridge Element series in creativity and the imagination. I am honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer today. Today's presentation is entitled The Myths and Truths of the Creative Brain. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Abraham.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be able to give this address. I have the great misfortune of being someone who speaks very, very fast. I will try my best to go slowly for the sake of the interpreters, but I apologize in advance. If I go too fast, please give me a sign if I do. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see this? Yep, great. Thank you, Ella. Right, so I'm going to talk about something that I'm working on at present, which is a book in which I explore the myths and truths of the creative brain. And I think all of you might have some idea about where I'm already going with this, because these ideas and notions we have about creativity are pretty well known. So we have this idea that the creative brain is the right brain. There's this notion that psychedelic drugs boost creativity. There's a link between mental illness and creativity, brain damage and creativity in some ways. There's this notion that creativity is a talent that very few people possess. And for sake of time, we'll only limit it to 6, that creativity is somehow synonymous with a divergent thinking. Now, mine is certainly not the first myth book out there. There are several, but I take a slightly different approach. Usually people who write these sorts of books are focused on either saying yes or no. They're doing some sort of myth busting. And my approach is a little bit different. I'm trying to say that I pass a verdict on it, but I'm saying that these myths come to be because there is a kernel of truth in these claims, but it's not the whole truth. And we have to dig through the literature to find out where these notions started and why they started in order to truly understand how they came to pass. Okay, so I hope to convince you of this treatise today. I first want to start with an acknowledgement of the challenge that it is to study creativity, because it can manifest in many different forms. So let's start with scientific creativity. Here, creativity can take the form of the discovery of something new. So it exists, but we didn't know it existed. It can take the form of an innovation, a modification of something that already exists. Like in the picture there I'm showing you, it's an incubator made out of car parts, for instance. Or in the scientific realm, a creative idea can take the form of an idea, something intangible, like the idea of evolution, which is considered to be the most creative idea or the most important idea of the 20th century. If you look at the arts, of course, there are as many different manifestations of art as there are modalities and cross modalities. So you can have umpteen different types of the fine arts and applied arts. But there are other ways in which we can be creative. There is a social sphere in which we can be creative. So people can convince us to change our ideas, our behaviors, our attitudes, change our lives. An example of that would be politicians here, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi and his idea of nonviolent action to remove oppressors from my native land, which is India. It can take the form of something that has no person particularly associated with it, or at least it's an idea that had a seed somewhere and develops widely. So I think the first sort of universal healthcare idea was born in Germany in 1894. And within 100 years, more than 100 years, you find that most countries, as shown in green or in blue, either have free and universal healthcare or have free or universal healthcare, right? There are very few that don't. And it's sort of like an amazing idea that took very little time to pass across the entire globe. So creativity has many different manifestations, and there are many ways in which we can break it down to try and understand it better. So I've made a very lazy distinction here: 4 types of artistic creativity: visual artistic, musical, literary, and kinesthetic. And at the end, there's scientific creativity. I have included intrapersonal and interpersonal creativity. And you might think this kind of breaks it down rather well, but if you look close enough, there are many forms that come from breaking through these types that I've just put up there. So for instance, songwriting is a kind of creativity where musical meets literary creativity. Architecture is an example where visual artistic creativity meets scientific creativity. So the challenge is huge, but what it tells you is that there must be something fundamentally generic or generalizable across different modalities, something domain general about creativity. And that's what most creativity researchers try to zone in on, okay? So when we think...
Okay, now
So
it seems like people are able to see the interpreter on the slide. So I will turn off my camera now and turn it back over to Dr. Abraham. Sorry for interrupting the presentation. Thank you for bearing with us.
Okay, am I okay to keep going now? Okay, yes. I can't see the chat window, unfortunately, from here, so I can't see if people are having troubles. But yes, just interrupt me if there's anything else that comes. So we were talking about how to define creativity, and most people associate it with the arts. And that would mean that creativity is a sort of manual, physical skill, right? And I think a lot of people would take issue with this because, of course, I have 2 examples here of great renditions of an apple, but that is not necessarily a way that we can say that all creativity is. So if I tell someone to depict an apple, someone might come up with something like this. So there are whole websites devoted to so-called apple art. And if you try to define what it is that is funny or cool about this, what might be creative here, in some sense, it's about doing something new through something known. Very vague, but that's how I would look at it. Maybe that's what creativity is. But then people can say, no, there are other ways in which to be creative. So this is a generic, very, very iconic picture of the musician Jimi Hendrix. And this is a rendition of an artist, and it's kind of clever what they've done here, right? The Hendrix pictures, for instance, are not as made of celluloid. It's a known picture, but something new has been done. So something known being depicted through something new is what's happening here. Still others might say, well, it doesn't, that's not enough to be creative. To be creative, you must create something that's completely new, not even slightly old, right? So making an object out of a Lego box following the instructions by some people would not be considered particularly creative. But making completely some new kind of sculpture through Lego, that would be creative. Still others would say, well, this focus on the arts is too hard. Let's focus on language, in the world of advertising is very known for its creativity. This is an advert here that Coke got a lot of trouble for, because of course they're saying because they're saying you're on Coke, yeah. So it brings sort of the idea of a dual meaning that has to be processed. So in literary spheres, very often creativity comes from bringing in layers of meaning in that you wouldn't see otherwise. Another example would say, well, that those layers of meaning mean that creativity is not just about being new, it has to be somehow surprising. So here's an ad, for instance, of a dog that's so strong from eating pedigree food that is able to sort of dig through tarmac, right? Obviously, it's an exaggeration. It's not true. But the creative element here lies in the surprise. Still others would say, no, well, all it has to do is to really draw attention. So here's an example of a funeral service in an underground subway that very cheekily, very dark humor here, asks people to come closer so that they'll fall and then the funeral service can get, well, more service. Still others would say, well, you know, creativity is really just about standing out from the rest. That's where you see the impulse of creativity come in. If you recognize something as creative, it is when something stands out. Yeah. But is that enough is another question. So I've taken two examples here from the world of fashion. So the gown on my left is an interesting one. I find that I know it's very subjective, right? But if I look at that gown, I'm like, oh, that struck me as being interesting. It's odd, but it's wearable. I think I get why it's cool. The one on the right, though, it's just odd to me. It's not, I don't find it creative at all. I just find it strange. Putting a baguette on your head is, to me, not creative, for instance. And we will all defer in which we find either of these or both of these creative or not creative. But central thing is oddity enough, right? So when we think about creativity as an empiricist like me, I only think about minimum conditions necessary for creativity, right? And the definition that we use now can be linked back to the 50s, where two components were highlighted as being essential for creativity. One is novelty, which is that a product did not exist previously in precisely the same form. Yeah. So how novelty is defined is the extent to which it deviates from the traditional or the status quo. Okay. But that element in and of itself is not enough. The work is novel if it's accepted as tenable or useful or satisfying. Okay. So with that, we have two elements that are minimum criteria for creativity. An idea is creative if it is original. Other words that are used interchangeably are if it's unique, unusual, novel, fresh, statistically, right? And if it's appropriate, if it's relevant, fitting, useful, satisfying, and has value, right? So both these components are really important, and the earliest researchers in creativity emphasize that. So, for instance, uncommon responses which are merely random or which proceed from ignorance or delusion are not adapted to reality, don't have that appropriateness touch. And the other side would say it must serve to solve a problem, fit the needs of a given situation, accomplish some recognizable goal. And this is as true of the expressive arts as for scientific and technological enterprises. In painting, the artist's problem is to find a more appropriate expression of his own experience. In dancing, to convey more adequately a particular mood or theme. Okay. So I'll give you an example to show you what I mean here, how the examples can be used. So one of the most widely used tasks to assess creativity is called the alternate uses task, where you're asked to generate as many uses as you can for a common object, like a shoe, okay? You'll get thousands of responses if you give it to many people. I've selected 3 here, okay? Let's take the first example. Someone says you can use an object to kill an insect. It's an example of a use that's not original. Why is it not original? Because out of 100 people, 99 or 100 out of 100 would have given this use. It's just not unusual. It's not new, but it is appropriate. You can use a shoe very effectively to kill an insect. Yeah. Another use, for instance, that a patient once said to me in a psychiatric clinic when I was testing him, he said, you can use a shoe to wash clothes. And I said, wait, what? Okay, can you explain? Because it wasn't immediately obvious to me. And he said, I don't know. I just said the first thing that came to my mind, you know? Now, it is an example of something that's original. Nobody that I've tested has come up with that use. But it wasn't appropriate because he couldn't explain to me how he could use that object in that way. Compared to the other uses then, saying that a shoe can be used as a sort of makeshift plant pot when your plant pot breaks is an example of a use that is both original and appropriate, and therefore meets the criteria of what it means to be creative. Okay. Now, this definition applies in fields of expression, artistic expression, for instance, as well as in problem-solving domains like in the sciences. It's ubiquitously used, right? There are, of course, lots of problems with these definitions, and I will basically talk about one of them. One is that with the word appropriate. Now, when I present this kind of work to artists, they are deeply offended by that anything creative would have to be appropriate, right? So I go back to the definition where you say, well, what is a creative work? A creative work is a novel work that is accepted as tenable, useful, or satisfying. Now, these are three very different terms. And more now, I'm leaning towards using the word satisfying a little bit more, Let's think about it in the context of magnitudes of creativity. In creativity research, we distinguish between little c, everyday creativity. For instance, I like to cook. I like to try out new sort of made up recipes. So when I go home tonight and I cook for myself, and if I try something new, I'm exhibiting everyday little c creativity. I've created a new product, a new dish that is novel. And if it tastes good, it's going to be satisfying to me. Yeah. The word appropriate doesn't quite fit as well when you explain it this way, but satisfying does. However, my dish is probably not going to be assessed as groundbreaking by the large majority of people, certainly not like a big chef. If I produce a dish that is not just satisfying to me, but to virtually everyone who tries it, then I'm hitting big C creativity, eminent forms of creativity, like the biggest chefs in the world do, right? Another way to distinguish it is individual or I creativity. This has been called personal or psychological creativity, and historical creativity, the kind of creativity that changes the world, where the ideas change the world. Another formulation of magnitude has been recently proposed, and that's sort of not going with the twofold division, but a fourfold division, right? In trying to recognize creativity, even in the youngest people, they distinguish between mini C creativity. This is the kind of creativity that children display when they're kind of exploring their environments. Little c, then, everyday slightly objective, at least to myself, creativity. I know, for instance, that the poem I wrote 2 months ago was probably better than the ones I wrote 2 years ago, yeah, because I'm tracking my progress. Then comes pro-C creativity, people with either recognized talent or a drive, a desire to make it in specific professions that are considered to be artistic professions. And finally, again, big C, the ones whose ideas change the world, yeah? Now, what's interesting about this is the level of satisfaction and novelty that is associated with each level. Who's viewing your product or your idea as both novel and satisfying? Yeah.
Dr. Abrams, we're going to switch interpreters.
Okay. Right. So I think what this shows us, this magnitude shows us from subjective creativity, mini C, all the way to big C, is that all humans possess the drive to be creative. We are born with it. It's just that some pursue this drive more than others, okay? The question is it because, why is that? Why do some people pursue this creative drive more than others? Is it because they're born with some sort of talent? Is it because they're more driven? Is it because they persevere more, they stick with the problem longer? Or is it because it's inherently rewarding? The jury's kind of out on this so far, but we do know that this is an inherent drive that we all have and a capacity that we have, yeah? We know it because we have people at both ends of the age spectrum who can engage in these sorts of acts. So here's Mozart. This is the first composition he made. He was 5 years old when he produced the Minuet and Trio. And he was, of course, enormously productive throughout his life. And his talent of musical composition was recognized fairly early. You go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, Grandma Moses, who didn't really do any sort of visual art before the age of 78. She was more of a needlework person, but when she developed arthritis, she moved on to the visual art form, and she was able to honed this craft and became a really celebrated and highly successful painter. You can't enter a profession so late if you don't have some inherent ability to do it, right? So this is why we would say creativity is not a talent. The first myth to bust is that creativity, the idea that creativity is a talent that few people possess is just not true. Some people are exceedingly talented, but it is a fundamental drive that each of us can draw on in order to hone, pursue, craft, and reach better levels, okay? So that's the first myth busted, if you want, or at least explained. Let's go back to the definition. Let's then move to the fact that we might be better placed to think about a creative response as one that is both original and satisfying, right? And so we've talked about individual levels of originality all the way to historic levels, yeah, of originality. What about when you try to, the number of categories there are to define something as appropriate or satisfying? It turns out there is too many ways in which to assess this because it's very individual, it's culturally based, it's historically based, and so on. The example I like to give is the example of mink coats that were the most sought after piece of clothing for centuries. And that's no longer the case because we live in a world where animal rights are very respected. So it's less and less seen as the thing that everyone should have. For instance, it's not appropriate, it's not satisfying to own this that much anymore. A third element that a lot of researchers point out, including Simonton and Bowden, is that the element of surprise needs to be there. When you look at an idea, when you come across an idea that's creative, it's only creative if it seems surprising to you. This is what the US Patent Office requires as well to patent something. You have to show that there was a surprising step in order to register a patent. Yeah. There are three types of surprise. Something can be statistically surprising, the shock of recognition, and impossible surprise. Yeah. I'll explain this a little bit further. Let's take statistically surprising first. This is kind of demonstrated in the dress I showed you before. When I first saw it, I experienced a moment of, oh, that's very odd and surprising, you know, but it's just because it's statistically surprising. Not many dresses have holes in them, for instance, right? Another kind of surprise is the shock of recognition. I experience this a lot when I watch stand-up comedy, which I love, which is that they're saying things that ring true, have a resonance, and you have a shock of resonance of the concept being activated in your own mind. And the final kind of surprise is called impossible surprise. It's the kind of ideas that you think this can't be true, you know. Here's Cajal who came up with the idea of the neuron doctrine, for which he won the Nobel Prize, for instance. When he proposed it, it was sort of people, you know, everyone thought that was one, the cells in our brain are all physically connected to each other. And he proposed the idea that they're actually separate and separated by infinitesimal little gaps. So this was an incredible, it generated impossible surprise when it was proposed. There are many ways to reach that kind of surprise. Some comes from essentially combinational sorts of approaches, like Gutenberg did by bringing together what was known about printing them and an ancient agricultural method to derive oil out of seeds, an oil press, and he applied it to the printing context. You can do it in a sort of exploratory sort of approach where, for instance, you see this in ice cream flavors or coffee flavors around the holiday period where you're thinking, okay, a pine needle ice cream required a sort of exploratory search space. And transformational, the kind that leads to those impossible surprises, right? Like transforming a concept in concept space. Like Freud's idea of the importance of the unconscious. It was absolutely bizarre when it was seen as bizarre when this was proposed. There are many ways in which to study creativity, what's called the 5 Ps of creativity. I'm going to zip through this because we've lost a little time. The first is the process aspects of creativity, which is trying to find out what's happening in your mind when you're trying to be creative. The second is product, looking at the product itself in order to determine creativity. Personal is looking at personal attributes, like things like personality factors and intellectual attributes. Place is to see how the environment affects your creativity. And physiology is the kind of approach that I use, which is to understand what your brain is doing when you're trying to be creative, right? So I will just skip through these and come to the process aspect of creativity, which is what we're focusing on. What does a creative mind involve? Now, process-based approaches are largely cognitive, and they follow a sort of problem-solving idea, right? When you're faced with a problem when there is no solution or answer that is clear, and then you start to engage in problem solving, which involves getting from an initial state, the problem state, through the operation state, where you find out how to deal with the problem, all the way to the goal state of solving the problem. So let's take the problem of hunger. Okay, we all know what it's like to feel hungry, and I'm actually quite hungry now, for instance. And I know what my goal state is. I know what it feels like to be sated, right? But my operation state will be very different. It's very different today because I'm speaking to you now, and I can't actually go nip to the kitchen to pick up something from my the university, the office kitchen here. And it would be very different if I was watching a lecture. I could just turn off my camera and then nip on and do it. So the operation stage is very varied, depends on what's possible at a given time. So even a simple problem like this has some complexity. It's very different from a creative problem though, right? Let's take the very famous candle problem, where a person's given a candle, a couple of tacks, a box of matches, and said, fix a candle to the wall such that it burns safely without dripping wax anywhere. And here, you know what the goal is, but you have no idea what the goal state looks like. You can't visualize it because that's part of your task. And people can do all sorts of things to try and solve this problem. You might form sub-goals. For instance, you might think, okay, let me think about how to fix it to the wall, and then I'll worry about trying to make it burn safely. You might think, engage in analogical reasoning, think about a problem you've experienced before that was similar. But ultimately, the way to solve this problem is by changing mental set, overcoming what's called functional fixedness. This problem, the visuals of this problem induce a certain restriction in the way we think. We see the box of matches as a receptacle for matches, and we have to change our mental set of functional fixedness about a matchbox to think of it as a way in which where it can be used, as a candle holder, a makeshift candle holder. Okay. So creative problem solving is that it's a problem solving where the solution is both novel and appropriate, and it can be applied in contexts that involve convergent thinking, that is zoning in on one answer, as we do in the one correct answer that we do in the candle task, or it involves divergent thinking, coming up with lots of solutions, as we did in the alternative uses task. Okay. So the important thing to think about is that divergent thinking is not synonymous to creativity. A lot about creative thinking involves thinking divergently, but not all divergent thinking is creative. You can think about the future and what it brings, the many possibilities there. It doesn't necessarily have to be creative, for instance. Okay. So that's the next myth busted. Yeah. Creative problem solving is not always divergent. Not all divergent thinking is creative. Yeah. Also, we have to recognize that when we try to solve a problem like that, the task where I told you to think of as many uses as you could for a shoe, what's happening in your mind is kind of spectacular because you're automatically engaged in drawing on very unusual cognitive processes that you don't always typically draw. One is conceptual expansion. So the first would be, so people, when they think about how to create an object, a new use for a shoe, they look at what else could this shoe be? Instead of foot protection, what else could they do? They look at the properties of the shoe and think, oh, it's got a hole on the top, it's got a space inside, it could be a kind of container. They also need to overcome their knowledge constraints. If they said they could kill a spider, they might say you could kill a cockroach, and so on and so forth. And at some point, they have to sort of get over their own knowledge of what they have used a shoe for in order to generate a new use. People report using a lot of imagery. One participant told me that, oh my God, you didn't really specify which shoe. This is when I used the word shoe. So I thought I'd go for a stiletto because a stiletto has different affordances and object properties than a flip-flop or a boot, right? Other kinds of associative processing happen, and logical reasoning. You automatically evoke metaphors. So in English, to kick off your shoes means to relax, yeah? And then seemingly out of nowhere, it hits you. An idea hits you. And it's very often experienced as an aha effect or eureka moment, a moment of insight. And the student who told me about the stiletto said, oh, well, I can use a stiletto as a baby hamster slide. All right. Now, if you look at any of these particular operations by themselves, and there are many that I haven't explored here, no single thing leads to that solution. It's all these processes working in combination that give rise to a creative response. So creative cognition, it should be noted, is complex and multifaceted. That is its very nature. And there are other issues to bear in mind when we understand the creative mind. The first is that the first idea in creativity research is that the creative brain is somehow different from the uncreative brain, or let's say the normative brain, yeah, or that it only partially overlaps. Okay, but decades of brain research has showed us that there's no single brain region, no single brain network, and no neural activity patterns that are exclusively in place for creativity. Yeah, just not there. Okay. What seems to be the case is all that we have is cognition, this informational toolbox of our brain, that in the context of creativity, what is really different is the context in which you're applying it. The situation that you're applying it to is vague, unknown, nonlinear, open-ended. Remember, you don't know the goal state. You're really not sure what operation state you have. And that's what makes something creative. And so you apply your usual cognitive toolbox in a novel context, and that what leads to creative cognition. Because our minds seem to be so different when we're trying to generate these new ideas and thoughts, there's a lot of ideas about how the mind is completely different, right? We have this idea that it's completely different, even though the brain science doesn't show it. The most dominant idea is the left brain versus right brain idea, that the right brain is, you know, the creative, colorful, imaginative brain, and the left brain is this logical, dry, absolutely strategic brain. And this is a meme, right? Because it's so well known that Mercedes-Benz over here is using it as an advert for their cars. Okay. The left brain, right brain idea is one of many dual systems ideas. The idea that we have this hidden part of ourselves that is zany and colorful and impulsive and just wants to break out, and the other outer shell of ourselves that has to be civilized and controlled and analytical and goal directed. Yeah, and there are many words to use this. Yeah, if you want, it's like the inner divergent self and the outer convergent self. So, for instance, some of the ideas like that, it's an associative versus executive brain, open mode versus closed mode, generate versus explore, primary process versus secondary process. That's from psychoanalysts. Divergent versus convergent that we've talked about. The main thing is that one part of your brain essentially is unconscious, involuntary, uncontrollable, and the other part is the opposite, conscious, voluntary, and controlled. And it so happens that when we think about brain sciences and the kind of networks that we have playing, two of the many networks that have been identified kind of map on onto these dual system modes, so that this divergent mode, or this, if you want, open-ended mode, this internal mentation mode is subserved by the default mode network, and the other control side, goal directedness, executive function, that's controlled by the central executive brain network. It's sometimes called the cognitive control brain network, and so on. And in dual system ideas of creativity, knocking out this control process gives rise to an overexpression of this associative internal side that leads to creative responses. This is the disrupted brain and creativity, creative idea. Let's take a couple of cases. Let's start first with someone very young, the very famous case of Nadia, who was diagnosed with as an autistic savant, so savant syndrome with autism, comorbidities. This is what Nadia was capable of drawing at the age of 5. She was perfectly healthy and functional, but she had no speech. She was not speaking at all. Didn't seem to understand language, didn't want to communicate in language. At the age of 3, she picked up a pen and was drawing a lot extensively. And this is what Nadia could draw at the age of 5. If you compare how it looks to what a typical 8-year-old would draw, and what Leonardo da Vinci drew in his prime, art experts have said that Nadia's drawing skills are closer to Da Vinci than they are to an 8-year-old, right? This is the idea that some part of her brain has been disrupted, and so that leads to this outpouring of creativity. And let's go to the other end of the spectrum, which is on much older samples, frontotemporal dementia. Very often this is post-stroke. What happens is that there's an atrophying of the anterior-most parts of the brain, shown here in dark gray. So that's the anterior-most part of the frontal lobe is the frontal pole, and the anterior-most part of the temporal lobe is the temporal pole, okay? Now, in a small subset of these patients, what happens is that they go on to develop what's called de novo, newly exhibited, newly sort of surfaced artistic skills, okay? And people who had no artistic bent before, didn't practice the arts, going through this in a small subset of them led to this explosion of creative activity. And it's not just intermittent, it's very, very pronounced. They stay at it. Many people change their jobs and decide to become artists. Yeah, so it's kind of, again, with the brain disruption, your creativity is somehow released. This is also the idea behind the creativity mental illness idea, that insufficiencies lead to advantages, okay? And the way to think about it is as a sort of inverted U function. So I'm showing you 2 graphs here to show normal development and impaired development are the 2 ends of the U's. When things are slightly wrong, but not too wrong, that's when you see advantages in creativity, right? So this is kind of like the Goldilocks effect, okay? Too much cognitive control is not conducive to creativity because it makes you rigid. Too little cognitive control is not conducive to creativity as well because it leads to chaos. Neither too much nor too little is conducive to creative ideation, right? So again, the slight disruptions of brain functions. There's also sort of national birth registry data to speak to this. So this work by Simone Chiaga, he looked at 3, in this particular one, he looked at 3 patient groups: people with schizophrenia, people with bipolar disorder, people with unipolar depression. And what he's looking at is the odds ratio for someone being in a creative profession if they're either a patient who has schizophrenia or if they're 1st degree or 2nd degree relatives. So the important thing to note is this line, this vertical blue line, and anything to the right of it means that there is a higher odds of being in a creative profession, whereas anything on or below means that the odds are not in your favor, right? So with schizophrenia, patients have, if you are a patient who has schizophrenia, you're not more likely to be in a creative profession. But if you're the parent of someone who has schizophrenia, the sibling or the offspring, for instance, or the parent sibling, you are more likely to be in a creative profession. In the case of bipolar disorder, both patients and their 1st degree relatives, all of them are more likely to be in creative professions, okay? Whereas in the case of unipolar depression, they're not the patient, a little bit with the parent, but very little evidence that having that kind of genetic disposition will lead to you being in a creative profession, okay? So these sorts of studies speak to the disrupted brain creativity idea. What we have is
if you don't mind, Dr. Aber, thank you.
Yeah. So these sorts of problems lead to the disrupted brain and creativity idea. But we have a problem of understanding where the cycle begins, the chicken egg problem, right? So is the creativity making them mentally ill? Is a mental illness making them creative? That's yet to be determined. What we know for sure is that people who have any sorts of, typically in most countries, if you've suffered from a mental illness, there are very few avenues open to you in terms of professionals that you can get into. The creative arts are one of them, that they are open to pretty much anyone, okay? So that would explain a lot about why you might see someone there. Another thing is that being in a creative profession, through most of human history, has not led to having an environment with any stability, not that much instability. It has more instability, as was shown in the COVID-19 pandemic, where the arts were completely slaughtered, right? Like theaters closed, museums closed, artists lost their jobs and so on. They were the sector that was the most affected. So they have very precarious sorts of environmental factors there. They're less likely to have full-time employment, go from job to job and so on. So it's very hard to know whether what this equation is. Even if you say this, there is a link there, what's causing it is really not, it's yet to be determined. So as far as this myth is concerned, there is a link, but it really matters what kind of mental illness you're talking about, but we don't know the directionality of the link. It's a very hard problem to contemplate. In relation to that, let's look at another idea that's there to kind of explain disrupted brain and creativity. And that's the idea of paradoxical functional facilitation. This is a great book for anyone who's interested, that essentially has lots and lots of experiments and case studies of people who went through some sort of neurological injury and ended up exhibiting incredible feats of memory, perception, action. It's that's why it's called paradoxical facilitation, functional facilitation. Disrupted brain injury leads to facilitation of some psychological function. While that phenomenon is true, it is rare for one thing, but it's true. But the main point is in case of creativity is that it's not necessarily creative, right? So let's take the case of Savant syndrome, where you see prodigious ability, like in the case of Kim Peek, who is the person on whom the movie Rain Man is sort of based on. Yeah, Kim Peek has the most amazing photographic memory. He died a few years ago. Upon his death, it was documented that he had fully memorized 12,000 books, which means that you could say this book on this page, top word, what's that? And he could tell you. So he didn't really read a book as much as scan it in a few seconds each page, right? Now, of course, this is incredible skill. And if you look at his brain, that's the normal brain to my left, and that's Kim Peek's brain to the right. You can see that Kim's brain lacks a lot of white matter tracts, the major ones, including the corpus callosum, but also the anterior and posterior commissure. The cerebellum is also rather small. So this would kind of fit the idea of paradoxical functional facilitation. He's born with a brain that is different, and that leads to his creativity. But as I said, not all innovative behavior is creative. And this is the case of, I think it was Dalia Zadel who made this case when she was looking at de novo creativity in frontotemporal dementia. She made a case, she said the following: in neurological cases, the turning to art is itself innovative. Okay, so it's a new thing that the person is doing, novel and satisfying to them. Yes. Mini C creativity. Yes. I creativity, individual creativity. Yes. Yeah. The produced art, however, is not necessarily creative as judged by others. Okay. So what she's saying here, I think, if I've interpreted it right, is that breaking down one part of your system, the control system, and allowing a release of your associative system leads to an enhancement of an exploration and innovative behaviors. It increases your little CI creativity and individual creativity. But in order to have the kind of ideas that change the world or have a wider impact beyond your personal life, you need to have both modes on. Yeah, you need to have your associative and your executive system in functional form to have really big ideas. And most importantly, it's not one network on or one network off. What you see in creativity studies is the involvement of multiple networks, especially things, the semantic cognition network, which is involved in knowledge access, knowledge storage and integration, and knowledge retrieval. Yeah, so that would be expected, I think. So what we need to understand is to consider the magnitude of creativity when we try to understand this link between brain damage and creativity. And another thing we need to consider is not just the novelty element, but also the appropriateness, relevance, satisfying, as we call it, of the creative response. Okay, so that's that. The creative right brain is not the right brain is not the seat of creativity. It is the whole multiple brain systems are involved. Yeah. There's one caveat I do want to make in terms of the creative brain and creativity idea. And that is when you look at artists who develop brain disorders. Okay. This is a very famous case of the artist Annie Adams, who had PPA, primary progressive aphasia. And just by luck, we have brain scans of what her brain was like and correspondingly what kind of artwork she was producing in that year before she had symptoms and once the symptoms developed and afterwards. And that's because when she was very young, she had some sort of tumor on her auditory nerve that needed to be removed. So she was always going in for scans regularly to make sure that that was fine. And so they discovered all these a history of scans with her. So you can see what happens. 1998, she's pre-symptomatic. In two years later, she has the first language-based symptoms. In 2002, the diagnosis is made, and then she has this evaluation in 2004. There's this gradual atrophying of her temporal lobes, as you can see here, the frontotemporal areas, yeah? What I want to draw attention to, though, is her artwork doesn't stop. She continues to produce art. There is some case to be made for the style changing from a more abstract to a more concrete style. There's not enough of these kinds of studies to make a clear case for that. But what's amazing is that she continues to produce art. And this is true of all sorts of artists that have been studied over the years. For anyone who's interested, there are these handbook series of neurological disorders and famous artists. And by and far, for the vast majority, artists who develop brain disorders, unless they're completely incapacitated and are unable to move their limbs or get out of bed and so on and so forth, they continue to produce art. If they use their right hand to make art and they can't use their right hand anymore, they use their left hand. They change modalities. They create ways in which they can continue to produce art. This speaks to the damage-resistant capacity of the human brain to create and engage in artistic expression, right? We're not sure why this is there, but it's kind of fantastic because it's very easy to knock out individual functions, as you must have learned in your neuroscience lectures of, little lesion here wipes out this particular function. But creativity is different. It's damage resistant in many ways. There's a lot of questions about why that is. And one particular hypothesis is that we have this drive to communicate in any way possible. So if I become aphasic and I'm unable to communicate verbally anymore using spoken language, I will find another way to communicate, right? And artistic expression is one way to do so. So that's that truth, that myth busted there. The final one that I'll do very quickly, since we're running out of time, is the one with psychedelic drugs and creativity. Now, understandably, of course, there's very limited empirical work on this topic, although it's growing now because there are more sort of psychedelic research labs growing. So you have the heyday period in the 50s and 60s, and then almost no studies allowed. And recently things have opened up. The central idea here is that taking these drugs leads to a reduction of cognitive inhibition, and that leads to an increase in original, unusual responses, and therefore an increase in creativity. Now, there are very mixed findings of all the studies that have been there. It depends on a lot of things, the kind of drug, the kind of creativity task you're looking at, your baseline level of creativity, and so on. And there's a very big problem of a selection bias in these studies because you only get participants who are willing to take drugs. So there's an openness to experience, to new experiences, which is one of the most positive factors associated with creativity, your openness to experience. So there's a confound there. This is what it's like to produce art under the influence. This was a study in very, very early on by Oscar Jeniger. Gives them LSD, an artist is drawing a portrait, draws with charcoal, claims to feel normal. After 85 minutes, patient says, I can see clearly, I'm having trouble controlling this pencil, but you can see the art is degraded. Suddenly, the next one is between 2.5 hours, they produce 3 images. And this is what the patient says. I feel, obviously they're having a slip of consciousness here. I feel like my consciousness is situated in the part of my body that's now active, my hand, etc., etc. I'll jump across a few. Much further in, the patient is agitated, is sort of like everything has changed and so on and so forth. They're clearly having a psychedelic experience, yeah. And then they change the medium of drawing to tempera. And then it goes on. They're very, very distracted. They're trying to do something, but they can't quite bring it all together and so on. This one, the estimates is being a good drawing, this particular one. Complaints about being able to hold what is now a crayon, changes medium again. And finally, when it's over the intoxication period, the patient draws one and is unsatisfied with what they've done. And they said, this is bad, uninteresting, I want to go home now, right? So being under the influence itself has not actually helped it. It's in fact deteriorated his ability to produce something creative. And that's kind of what's been found in sort of systematic reviews, right? There is an association, it's an interesting association which we come to later between creativity and substance use, but there's no evidence that this clearly shows that it directly contributes to or facilitates the artistic process, right? Now, certain skills may be subject to change as a consequence of substance use, and that might change the style of creativity. And that's what they're referring to there is after the experience, you might see the world differently. So within the psychedelic state, you're not really going to be producing anything, but in the afterglow stage or the residual effect stage, which is much more long-term, something you may have experienced there might change the way you approach the world and thereby your creativity. And Aldous Huxley pointed this out in 1960 in an interview. He's famously known for experimenting with LSD and, of course, wrote great books about it. And in this interview, he's asked specific questions, like, would the drug give more help to the lyric poet than the novelist? And he says, oh, that's hard to imagine because during the experience, you're not really interested in doing anything practical. You know, you're busy enjoying what your perceptual world and how it's changing. Interviewer, but the artist Tallis won't be any different from what they were before he took the drug. And he said, not even an artist who takes it would necessarily get an advantage. Maybe artists like Odilon Redon, whose art looks like this. And that's because he said he saw the world like that anyway. He was a synesthete, so he didn't need LSD to get into that phase, but perhaps he took it since he has a baseline by which he operates that way, he might gain from it, for instance. But you can see this painting on the right in brown. It's called Hallucinations by Odilon Redon. I don't think it looks much more interesting than the ones on the left, for instance, right? Last questions. Do you see any relation between the creative process and the use of drugs as LSD? And Huxley rightly points out there's an enormous variation in the way people respond. For most people, it's an extremely significant experience. And I suppose in an indirect way, it could help the creative process. But he points out, you can't really say, I want to write a magnificent poem and take LSD. I don't think it is by any means certain that you would get the result you wanted. You might get almost any results. Yeah. So with that, we have the last myth explained. I've explored 6 here, myths and truths, and what I would say, and I hope I'm able to make a case for this, is that my verdict on these claims is that they all stem from a kernel of truth. They're not insane. They're not totally mythical. But if we generalize them and overstate them, that's when they become myths. And so there's a kernel of truth, but it's not the whole truth. And this is a book that I'm writing at the moment. It's in contract with MIT Press. I hope it'll be out in a year or so. If you want to know more my work that I've already produced, I have Neuroscience of Creativity, which really goes to tell you a lot about how the neuroscientific approach for creativity works, and it's accessible to complete beginners. And more recently, I edited this interdisciplinary volume, the Cambridge Handbook of the Imagination, which basically brings people from across all sorts of disciplines, from anthropology and religion, psychology and neuroscience, psychology, sociology, arts, and so on, musicians, all talking about their take on the imagination. And with that, I come to the end of this lecture. I thank you all for listening patiently, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Would you mind taking or stop sharing your screen? Yeah, that way people can see each other more easily. Thank you. Again, if people have questions, you can either type those in the Q&A. Let us know if you like to sign your question or not. I was fascinated by your presentation, and I feel like I could continue watching you all day, really forever.
Thank you.
So interesting. I don't see any questions at this point, but I always have questions, so I will start and give people some time to type out their question. The example of Nadia, the autistic child, you showed her artwork of a horse, which then made me think, did she herself create that picture of a horse, or was that something that she saw a picture of already and was trying to replicate and just had amazing drawing skills? So was she simply copying art that she'd already seen or remembered versus producing something that, from a hook? Or, something that it just makes me think about, one part is actual skill and one part is actual expression. And, people can't really draw, but maybe they have an amazing idea. Other people maybe have amazing drawing ability. They could copy things very well, but, they can't produce something in and of themselves that's novel. So would you mind commenting about that?
Yes. Yes, I'm glad for that question, because that's kind of why I opened when I started the definition with creativity. I don't want it to be associated only with a specific kind of skill, right? And that's the road to go down. I don't believe I know for sure if she was copying or not. I think not, because she generated her drawings spontaneously from such an early age, and it was kind of like she was communicating with herself through it. It wasn't for anybody, and she would do it a lot. This was the thing that she did. So I don't know if I can rule out that she didn't, she'd seen it somewhere and was trying to copy it. Maybe she was, but it was seen as the pattern of behavior that she exhibited as a default, which was to draw and draw spontaneously. And what was interesting about her case and why it became very controversial later is that as she became a teen, her language skills were trained up, right? So she started to learn how to speak and use language, and then she stopped drawing. And so she's a rare case of that. That doesn't always happen, but I think the disrupted brain creativity group were like, yeah, look, when she started becoming, in quote unquote, more functional, then suddenly she didn't need to draw. But I think that is the only case where we've been able to, that has been found. So I wouldn't, but you might find if you look her up that this story is there. But it's certainly, there are lots of savants who have artistic skills. It's just it's one of the more common forms of savant behaviors. And typically, even if they do learn how to communicate in ways that are verbal, the skill doesn't disappear. But yeah, I think I would say that because there's a lot of questions about savantism and creativity, and whether even someone like Kim Peek, who was great at memorizing things, but was really found it difficult to understand metaphor and use generative language. That only came very late in his life. In fact, the first sort of cases that were made about autistic savants that they're great memorizers, they're not generative. And towards the end of I forget the name of the person who brought them to fame, he said, well, they just need more time, because towards the end of Kim Peek's life was when he started to use language in a very in ways that we would think is creative, wordplay and metaphors, and come up with his own ways of, but he was very much doing show and tell before, right? Which was, I know this, I'll tell you what you need to know. And he was playing with language only much later. So I think even that, where you'd say, well, even if they are drawing from memory, having that in mind, it's still a process of translation onto the paper, so yeah, I wouldn't say that it's uncreative, but how creative it is versus how much it's just a memory. But the main thing was that she's able to see details. What we say is that they have access to sort of bottom-up information that people who are not atypical would just ignore. So typically what you see is that these kids are seen like, it's like raw access that we're all born with, by the way. It's just that our synapses get pruned in a certain way that we don't need it, right? So all children are born with the capacity to learn any language, and then they sort of listen to one language or exposed to one language, and then everything else falls out. But there is this period where they're kind of pluripotent. They can do anything. Like all kids can tell the difference between faces, but also like not just human faces, but also faces of other animals, like monkeys, for instance. But like 8 months down the line, they can't do it anymore. All the monkeys look the same to them. And so there's this particular thing in which our brains become more efficient and start doing things better and better for accuracy and speed. And the downside of that is that we don't really register too much raw, low level and bottom up information. And so people like kids with savant syndrome have that access. They've got a disruptive top down system, And so they have the kind of access that most people wouldn't really paying much attention to. So that's what the research would show. Sorry, very long answer.
So it seems our interpreter is frozen.
Oh gosh.
So I'll give the interpreter a second to switch. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much. We see 4 questions in the Q&A. And then I have more questions, of course, but I will hold my second question while I read the questions in the Q&A. So I see Lorna has a question. Lorna, do you want to come up? Lorna, would you like to read your own question?
Oh, she can't.
Okay, she can't. All right, let me give you permission, Lorna. Oh, okay. Sure, let's see if I can read it myself. Simple question. So Lorna's question says, I'm curious to learn how you decided to approach your neuroscience research with various methods. How did you determine when EEG, as opposed to fMRI, would be more appropriate for a specific study?
Yeah. For me, it's a combination of what is available. So very practical, and what are the unique things that each approach does. So they have the similar limitations when it comes to you can't move much, you can't test them forever, that sort of thing. So all of they have the same disadvantages. So when I'm trying to, for instance, if there's a hypothesis I have about which brain networks are involved, I can't do that with EEG because there's only so much in terms of spatial resolution that you can get from that method. So that's when I would definitely use fMRI, particularly when I want to I'm interested in the areas and the networks of focus. When I'm interested in the more temporal side, so when I've used EEG is to really get a sort of finer analysis of what's happening in the mind at the moment of when you're having a response that involves creativity or your concepts are being expanded, then there is no substitute for EEG because, of course, fMRI's temporal resolution is kind of pathetic. So, but then you have to, so what I faced with is the kind of studies I do have to be tailored depending on the kind of method I use, right? So the most useful EEG studies I did for the creative side is when I had these sort of studies where, like the metaphor study, where the word comes at the end, and then you can sort of really pinpoint when that critical word comes, what happens in the mind. Whereas doing that in the scanner would just not give rise to in the brain scanner for fMRI would not give rise to any real, very insightful new kind of knowledge. So I look at what the technique does well, and then I try to sort of create designs to get at specific questions. So I was interested in understanding what happens in the mind when you're forming a novel association. What on earth is going on? Because we hadn't looked at that, you know? And so I came up with 2 experimental designs in order to test that, things that didn't exist out there. And so on. So my question, I look at what's there, I look at my questions, and I see at any given point what question can be addressed with what method, and then design an experiment in order to do that. That's kind of the approach. And some things you can only answer by looking at like patients with lesions. That's a little simpler in many ways, because if you give them paper pencil tasks, they can do that. There are other limitations, of course, that could come with being unable to use, you know, a pen as effectively as a younger person would, and so on. So each method has their pros and cons, but I'm a big fan of oblique methods, like not to go at the problem like that, but indirectly. And then to try and come up with different paradigms towards the same thing. And then, if whatever corresponds is being similar across different experiments, you can be pretty sure that, okay, these are the brain network patterns, or these are the electrical activity patterns that associate with this kind of creative cognition process.
Yeah, I think that
Yes.
process of evaluating what your question is and what method is available really happens often, right? We don't always have the budget. We have budgetary constraints, or we don't have enough access. But just interesting to see how you approach that. All right, there's more questions in the Q&A. And from Elena Radutsky. An excellent presentation. Can you speak to any studies of bilinguals, especially bimodal bilinguals? For example, sign language and majority languages, as compared to monolinguals or unimodals?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it hasn't been done, not in the field of creativity at least. It's completely unexplored to my knowledge. I might be missing some literature. So if anyone was interested in looking at something like that, please get in touch with me. But creativity research, I think, is still seen as pretty niche, not many people study it from it. I mean, it's very different now to when I started doing my PhD for sure, but it's still pretty niche compared to many other fields like memory and attention and so on and so forth. So there's a lot that still needs to be done, and certainly bilingualism and so on has not been looked at all in terms of creativity, at least not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there anything you're aware of that has to do with just the more simplistic notion of bilinguals, perhaps without the bimodal aspect?
Yeah, in terms of creativity specifically, since I'm bilingual myself, I kind of look out for that literature, and I know that it isn't done. There is work of course, there's tons of work in terms of language comprehension and so on in the language domain that we could use as a sort of foundation from which to make specific cases. So, but this would be the thing that is worth testing, because I always sort of make a case for multimodality or cross-modality in being able to come up with better ideas and bigger ideas or unusual ideas. Think of in ways, in a crossed system. So the only crossed systems that have been studied in some detail, not even too much, is synesthesia. So people whose perceptual systems are crossed, right? Like, I don't know, I say numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the person who's a synesthete sees colors or shapes and forms and so on. And there is higher indices of creativity in people who are synesthetes, for instance. So that's clear, seemingly clear in a few studies that have been done. But other sorts of systems where there is a cross-modality happening, cross-connections, we would absolutely believe that there would be reasons to have definitely unusual associations and so on. Suddenly, like the only ways in which atypical systems have been looked at is with sort of neurologically atypical, not so much practice-based atypical. So people have studied dyslexia, people have studied children with autism, things like that. But bilingualism, I think, poses a real problem for study, because there are so many different varieties and types, and how early were you when you started, and so on and so forth. So I think it's definitely doable. The reason that people haven't is because much of creativity neuroscience work is still in its infancy. We're just starting to get there with more and more labs coming in. It certainly wasn't this way before. So I definitely see that as the way to go down. I'm very partial to the approaches of individual differences and the strengths that come from there. I study neurological samples, psychiatric samples, participants to really show that, where there is an information processing bias that says you might have a slight disadvantage here, it must translate as an advantage in another domain. If you put people in the right kind of context in which it will work, you'll find it. So my work on children with ADHD has shown that, so that they have an advantage over their neurotypical counterparts in one specific aspect of creativity, creative cognition, which is the ability to overcome a salient example. So when you're trying to be creative, the worst thing someone can do to you is to tell you, here's an example of how someone else created this new thing. And here are some more examples. And there's been studies where if you show examples and you kind of engineer them, that they have like a couple of features in common, when you get the chance to do it, your invention, like a toy, for instance, will have one or more of those features. ADHD kids are because they are distractible, they can overcome the salience of a distractor very well, and they come out as much better than neurotypical controls their age at coming up with an original idea. So I'm very much of that bend where we think, okay, if we can isolate what is where the advantage can be found, we can look at experiments or tasks that say, well, if this is really a bias is just seen as positive or negative depending on the context that it's in. So whatever could be a negative bias in one context can be a positive bias in another context. So most of my neuropsychological work has looked at that. So I would be totally looking to find, and I think this is kind of where the real promise of understanding creativity can come from, because it allows you to derive explanations for how the mechanisms of how we think this way works, right? Without looking at systems in which changed systems or differing systems, we always seeing as the so-called norm, and then we don't think to look elsewhere. So that is an approach that I've adopted, but not as, my samples have been limited. My populations of study have been limited to people with damage to specific parts of the brain lesions, and psychiatric populations, schizophrenia mainly, but also kids with ADHD, conduct disorder, and so on.
Yes. And what you mentioned about ADHD actually relates to my second question. And I'm sorry to other folks, but I do want to mention this since it's relevant. So once you show or provide examples to an individual, it could diminish their creative potential. And that relates to my question, because I'm thinking about the study that showed the model of drawing and participants replicating this provided limitation within a specific amount of time. And as their product decreases, they become less and less happy, less satisfied with their product and with their expression. So I'm wondering if, instead of providing examples or a model, why not just allow the participants to put out what they are feeling, to produce what they're wanting to express? I'm wondering why the experimental design isn't set that way, and why you think that might be, because it seems pretty contradictory to natural expression.
Yeah. I think it's the experiment when it was done, it was in the 90s, they were trying to make a case for, we usually think examples are helpful. And in most cases, they are. It's just that when you produce, and it's a kind of example that is unhelpful, which is that if you ask someone to engage in novel creative problem solving, generate something new, and they have no idea how to do it, and then they see how this new thing has been done by other people. So it's seeing a new example, not just any example, right? So there are experiments that use, so if I say the alternative uses task, and I can have a generic example of, oh, you can use a shoe to kill an insect, and you're like, yeah, I know that use. That won't constrain you. But if I say, oh, you can use a shoe as an ashtray, you're like, whoa, okay, your brain is busy processing this new information and is playing with it much more than it would otherwise if it didn't have that. It's a distraction. And it really is you're dealing with yeah, so that I think that the way it was designed was very clever because they wanted to show the constraints of something that we all automatically take to be as true. An example can only help. And you're like, well, none of the example basically is gets in the way of people feeling confident enough to be creative. If I think when, especially in the case of drawing, when I like the kind of, I just tried this in class today, so this was fun. I had students draw me, right? And I did this sort of sketch thing that they do in art school sometimes, which is sort of like Fibonacci sketching, which is you give them 1 minute to do it, and then 2 minutes, and then 3 minutes, and then 5 minutes, and so on. And you see them learn in the process of doing it. You're not really assessing, you're giving them practice. The example is their own though. So when you give them very little time, they have a rough sketch. The minute you give them more time, they notice more details, they produce more details, and it's a sort of a reverse example effect, if you want. If they saw, I mean, a portrait is not a good comparison, but if they saw a drawing of someone else interpreting an elephant or something, you know, if you're sitting around a statue of an elephant, all art students around, they intentionally block students from seeing each other's work because they don't want them to feel influenced by it or constrained by it. They want them to get to it fresh, right? So the freshness that your perspective brings to a particular creative problem is worth its weight in gold, even if it's naive. And so that's what the research shows. And they wouldn't have been able to show that if they didn't show how constraining examples can be.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Rihanna to the screen. Rihanna has a question she'd like to ask herself directly.
Yes.
Rihanna, you should have the appropriate permission to be able to turn your video on. Oh, Rihanna says she doesn't. John, would you mind doing that? Just one moment, please. In the meantime, while John is working on that, I'll read another question. Hi. So I actually have a few questions for you. The first question is, I have a 16-year-old student who has been diagnosed with Down syndrome, is also completely deaf, does not use any assistive technology, no hearing aid, no cochlear implant, nothing like that. However, this student has experienced severe language deprivation, has reduced cognitive abilities on the level of about 1 year old, and is physiologically 16. So during art class, when we go to art class, they typically draw the same image repeatedly over and over again. They draw a flower. And I try to give them examples of different objects or different things to draw, be it a rainbow or whatever the varied object may be. And this student will not attempt to draw anything else. So I'm wondering, and again, this student has Down syndrome, and I'm wondering if that leads to any differences that might cause this result. And my second question is, for my hearing students that have autism, they tend to speak in song, but when we do songs, they will only put out one specific lyric over and over again. But some of these students are amazingly skilled artists, like very, very good. And I'm wondering if in your history, you've ever seen any differences between individuals with Down syndrome, individuals with autism, individuals who are deaf, individuals who are hearing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have enough experience with people who have, at least to see them creatively up front, people with Down syndrome or deaf. But I mean, my son is autistic, so I watch him very closely. And so with autism, and I think when it comes to the developmental sort of disorders, autism, dyslexia are the best studied. I think primarily because sometimes in these really complicated experiments, it's about understanding instruction. So the interesting thing about autism is that when you compare them in terms of metaphor understanding, so this is one study that's really quite cool. Common language understanding is fine, metaphor understanding, common metaphor understanding, and so on. And then you do give them a task where they're generating novel metaphors, and they tend to sometimes outperform neurotypical controls. Okay. And that's because they just, and that again is an example of, you're like, yeah, why would that happen? Yes, of course, they're conceptually encoding the world very differently. So when they're trying to come up with a metaphor for something, they have a different source, the source material is varied, and they will come up with very varied things, ways of looking at the world. I have one of my favorite examples from what because I wear eye makeup, and whenever my son likes to watch me put on makeup, and then one day he said, what about nose makeup, right? And I was like, oh, if you know how to make it work, this is brilliant. We'd be billionaires in no time. But and I couldn't quite explain why nose makeup wasn't there, but I thought it was rather cool of him to notice that there is a gap in what you're doing on your face. And why isn't there this thing? And so the ability to ask exploratory questions that are a bit left of field is there in any kind of in any of these situations. The ability of the person to recognize that it's interesting as opposed to problematic or whatever is another matter. So it depends on who's are you able, the problem of creativity is recognition. Is anyone around you able to recognize that you are, with the child you were mentioning with Down syndrome who draws the same flower over and over again, I was reminded of this Oliver Sacks story of twins, severely autistic twin. I don't know how physiologically old they were, but chronologically they were certainly older than they presented, and they had no communication. But they would communicate with each other, and what they would do is, he noticed what they were doing was to talk to each other in math. Okay. And what they were doing was a prime number game, and he only noticed because he's into math. And so one would say a prime number, and the other would respond with the next prime number in sequence. And they were up in the hundreds. Like, they were nobody could understand what they were doing, but they could understand each other. And they were getting tremendous joy from it. So one person would just wait, and then he would say a number, and the other one would just smile. They would just smile in glee together, and then they would get to the next one. So what Oliver Sacks did was to join in the circle. Obviously he cheated because he did not have this ability to come up with, and so he opened a book with all the prime numbers were given, and then he essentially sat with them, and after they finished their, he came in as a third person and he said a number, and then they both acknowledged another human being then, because they were playing the game. He was playing the game, and then they continued in the cycle with 3 people, and then he came to the end of the book and he couldn't go on. He didn't have the material, but they let you in there. And I saying, one way to, again, this is so much easier for me to say than do, but connecting on a plane that they understand. So if they're drawing a petal, they're drawing petals, could you join in their drawing? Like, would they allow you to draw? What is the way in which, this is the hardest thing for a clinician from that standpoint, to understand the language being produced and how you can produce something that will resonate with them. I don't know if that's helpful for you, Rihanna, but that's a thing that came to me to say, it's partly understanding instructions, partly also wanting to do it. Maybe they just derive a lot of pleasure from drawing the same thing again and again. We know there's a lot of soothing, a sort of self-soothing involved in repeatedly doing something that is predictable. There is a reason that in Eastern traditions we would repeat to ourselves when we're meditating. We repeat the word Om. Repetitiveness is just gives an anchor of strength. So I would see the repetitiveness as not an indication of a lack of creativity, but as perhaps an indication of something else, and perhaps it's something that they enjoy and value, and that we're not getting necessarily, but that they do. So all I can say is Oliver Sacks's books might hold some insights there about what can be done.
Wonderful. So unfortunately, we are out of time. Just checking to make sure the interpreter was with me. But your most recent response is actually relevant to the last two questions. So I will very quickly read through those. You don't necessarily need to respond to them. We can simply leave with those two questions in our minds to reflect on. So the first question is, is creativity born of a need of necessity or beauty? And the second question relates to the story you mentioned about the twins communicating amongst themselves. And it seems as though the two of them may have just been doing that simply for their own enjoyment, may not have been of necessity or for beauty, just a connection or for their enjoyment. So thinking about the role of emotion and how that plays into creativity, both for the creative processes or in the production of something. I just thought both those two questions from the students really tied into your last comment.
Yes, definitely. I would say there is beauty in connection. Thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry, we never have enough time to get through all the questions. But if anyone has any lingering questions, feel free to email them to me, and then perhaps I can forward them on to you.
Yes, absolutely.
And thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everyone. We will have additional presentations in the new year. I believe the first is February 9th. Thank you, everyone.
So much. Thank you.